September 1st, 1943. The sun hasn't fully broken through the heavy clouds over Rabaul yet, but the heat already clings to the skin like a damp blanket. The air is a mix of kerosene, sea salt, and volcanic dust. Inside an improvised operations tent, lazy fans spin on the ceiling without managing to dispel the greenhouse feeling. There, surrounded by scribbled maps and yellowed reports, is the man everyone present treats almost like an entity, Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, the ace among aces of Japanese naval aviation. One of his eyes no longer sees the world. It's a milky patch, the permanent reminder of an encounter with the tail gunner of an American dive bomber. The other, however, remains sharp as a blade, the same eye that guided Sakai to dozens of victories in the skies over the Pacific. It's with this eye that he scans the lines of a new intelligence report until he stops, furrows his brow, and then, suddenly, bursts into laughter. It's not a timid, embarrassed laugh. It's a confident guffaw, the kind that infects those nearby. In seconds, other pilots join him. These are the elite of the Imperial Navy, men who spent years training to exhaustion and believe they have mastered the art of killing in the air. Sakai raises the paper and reads aloud, "The Americans have put a new carrier-based fighter into service. Grumman F6F, codename Hellcat." The name alone draws the first wave of sarcasm. Hellcat. To those men, it sounds more like a movie slogan than the name of a combat aircraft. But the real reason for the mockery comes right after, when Sakai reads the specifications. Maximum weight, over 12,000 pounds. Almost double that of a fully loaded Mitsubishi A6M Zero. High wing loading, robust structure, armor plates, self-sealing tanks, tons of extra metal. A heavy monster, a block of steel. In that world, however, weight is almost an insult. The Zero is the opposite of that. For over 2 years, it has reigned supreme over the Pacific. Born from the drawing board of Jiro Horikoshi, the A6M was designed as if someone had tried to materialize the concept of lethal lightness. Using special aluminum alloys, reducing every screw to the essentials, sacrificing anything that didn't directly contribute to performance, the Zero emerged from the paper as an almost unreal predator. To achieve this, Japan made a dangerous pact. The cockpit has no solid armor protecting the pilot. A single well-placed burst can pierce both man and machine. The fuel tanks don't seal themselves in case of a puncture. Many radios are removed to save a few pounds. Every gram that doesn't serve to fly or shoot is cut. The result is a fighter that climbs like a rocket, turns with humiliating ease for opponents, and covers distances that seem more like a bomber's than a fighter's. When the Americans finally got their hands on a relatively intact Zero, the famous Akutan specimen, their engineers looked at the performance data and, for a moment, thought there was a calculation error. Absurd range, frightening climb rate, tiny turning radius, all combined in one aircraft. For Allied pilots who survived the first encounters, the Zero seemed almost magical, a silver dot that appeared out of nowhere, slipped into your tail, and vanished, leaving only smoke and fire. And it's with this sense of superiority that the men in Rabaul view the report on the Hellcat. To them, everything in that spec sheet screams design error. A heavier plane, slower in turns, with much more load on the wing. Armor everywhere, reinforced tanks, overbuilt structure, American things, they think. Instead of perfecting the pilot, they put faith in metal. Instead of relying on individual skill, they trust the factory. In the tent, someone comments in a mocking tone that the Americans simply took a torpedo bomber and glued on smaller wings, calling that a fighter. Another mentally compares the Zero to a thin, sharp sword, ready for the duel, and the Hellcat to a workshop sledgehammer. Strong, yes, but crude, without elegance, without art. And there, in that moment, all that Japanese pride sees is the sledgehammer. They recall with satisfaction the victories over British Hurricanes, American P-40S, Dutch Buffaloes, flying museum pieces, in their view, all outclassed by the Zero's perfect dance. The entire Japanese doctrine was built on that dance: turn tighter, maintain energy in horizontal turns, get into the enemy's tail and destroy him in close, almost personal combats. And within that logic, a fighter with almost double the weight and a more loaded wing seems like nothing more than fresh meat for the Imperial aces. That's why the verdict in the tent comes quick. Hellcat? Another American mistake? Just another heavy, dumb plane that will pad Japanese victory statistics. A graceless toy designed by engineers who don't understand that the real differentiator is the man, not the machine. Even Sakai himself, who has seen it all in the war, can't contain the disdain. For someone who survived a near-fatal wound and kept flying, trusting his life to a flying truck seems almost absurd. But there's something none of them know in that stifling moment in Rabaul. Those laughs are, unbeknownst to them, the last gasp of an era. The Hellcat they treat as a joke wasn't born to play the same game. It was conceived to change the rules. Its numbers for weight, armor, and power aren't flaws. They're the signature of a completely different philosophy of waging war, a philosophy that doesn't care for the beauty of the duel, but for the efficiency of the kill. In less than 2 years, that clunker they imagined dominating and turning combats will prove to be something very different, a cold, repetitive, industrialized machine of destruction. A fighter capable of downing thousands of Japanese aircraft and logging a victory ratio so absurd that later, it would seem like propaganda exaggeration, something around 19 enemies shot down for each Hellcat lost. On that September 1st, 1943, however, all that is still future. Inside the tent, there are only experienced pilots laughing at a piece of paper. Outside, the blue Pacific sky looks the same as always. What no one notices is that, above the laughter, a new shadow has already begun to form, and it has the robust shape of an F6F. To understand why those men in Rabaul laughed with such confidence, it's necessary to go back a bit in time to the beginning of the war in the Pacific, when the Zero wasn't just a fighter, it was a myth flying. In late 1941, when it appeared over Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and other Allied bases, Western pilots barely had time to register what they were seeing. What seemed, at first glance, a simple Japanese fighter turned out to be something no combat manual explained properly. Survivor reports spoke of an airplane that climbed as if someone had turned off gravity. That entered a tight turn and came out the other side already pointed at the enemy's tail, as if it had bent the rules of physics. At Pearl Harbor, the Japanese lost a few dozen aircraft and left hundreds of American planes destroyed on the ground. In the Philippines, the pattern repeated, minimal losses for the Japanese side, maximum damage for the other. From the winner's point of view, it seemed confirmation of a deep belief Japan had achieved the perfect form of the naval fighter. When American engineers got their hands on a captured Zero and began studying its numbers, they got a shock similar to that of the pilots. The range was enormous for a fighter, the lightness absurd, the maneuverability almost insulting compared to Allied models of the time. But what was astonishment for the Allies was a source of pride for Japan and silent danger, the feeling that the formula was complete, untouchable. But the price of that perfection was high. The Zero was, essentially, a race car without a seatbelt. To gain range, protection was removed. To gain agility, structure was removed. To gain lightness, redundancy, radio, armor was sacrificed. In combat, that meant one simple thing: any well-delivered burst could turn an experienced ace into a ball of fire in seconds. But as long as the results remained crushing, few worried about it. Japanese doctrine said everything would be resolved with the pilot's spirit and the sharp blade of maneuverability. That mentality ended up shaping not only the plane, but how the Imperial Navy viewed the enemy. American planes were seen as flying trucks, robust, crude, full of steel, good for carrying cargo, not for dancing in the sky. Comments in Japanese barracks repeated that view. The Westerners built heavy machines to compensate for mediocre pilots. On the other side, the Japanese saw themselves as refined duelists, samurai who brought centuries of warrior tradition into the cockpit. That's why, when the first reports on the Hellcat arrived, they were read through that lens of arrogance. Enormous weight, loaded wing, armor plates, reinforced tanks, ammunition for a prolonged rain of fire. Everything seemed to confirm the prejudice: another factory brute, another target that, with a bit of skill, could be made to spin in circles until it fell. The math on paper seemed to support that. In horizontal turns, a well-flown Zero would theoretically leave the Hellcat in the dust. The laughter, however, began to die slowly, not with speeches, but with real encounters in the sky. The first shock came in the form of a visual mistake. Near the remote Marcus Island, a veteran Japanese pilot, experienced in escorting reconnaissance aircraft, spotted 6 dark dots climbing in the distance. He did what he had always done, interpreted what he saw based on everything he already knew. 6 large shapes, bulky fuselages. They could only be American medium bombers. Slow, predictable, perfect victims for a sharp Zero. As the distances shortened, however, something didn't add up. That didn't behave like a bomber. The formation was compact, disciplined, and the bombers turned with unusual speed for something so large. When the Japanese finally managed to make out the outline of the short wings, stubby nose, and huge radial engine, he understood they weren't bombers. They were fighters. They were Hellcats. Even so, he didn't feel immediate fear. On the contrary, he had almost the vain curiosity of a master craftsman observing a crude tool made by an amateur. He planned the opening maneuver according to the Japanese manual. He would enter a diving turn, use the Zero's much smaller turning radius to cut inside, drop onto the tail of one of the Americans, and destroy the intruder in seconds. It was the kind of maneuver he had performed so many times he could almost do it blindfolded. That's when the script tore. When the Zero began the maneuver, the Japanese pilot expected the opponent to try to follow the turn, fail, open up too much, or lose energy. Instead, the Hellcat did something that went against everything he considered correct in aerial combat. In that scenario, it pointed its nose up and climbed. Not a slow, timid climb, but a brutal ascent, as if it had found an invisible staircase to the clouds. The Japanese tried to follow, trusting the Zero's reputation as a climber, but this time, the math wasn't on his side. The Hellcat's engine, a much more powerful radial, yanked the heavy aircraft upward with a force the Zero simply couldn't match. Gradually, the Japanese pilot felt something he rarely felt in combat. The plane, light as it was, began to lose speed, hang in the air. Energy escaped, the climb wilted, the machine showed signs it didn't have the breath to continue in that game. Up there, the Hellcat seemed at ease. Reaching a comfortable altitude, it executed a maneuver that, in the Japanese's head, didn't match such a robust plane, an elegant turn at the top of the trajectory, reversing direction and pointing the nose back down. In seconds, the roles reversed. The Zero, which had started as a hunter trusting in agility, was now prey, with a heavy opponent diving on him with advantages in altitude, speed, and fire. The Japanese pilot still tried to escape with a desperate spin, using the reflexes that had kept him alive until then. But the first burst from above brought a painful revelation. It wasn't just 4 guns spitting fire, as he expected. The volume of ammunition tearing through the air was overwhelming. A wall of projectiles swept the space around the Zero, easily finding the unarmored fuselage. In seconds, the Japanese plane was shredded. That encounter ended with a Zero limping back to base, riddled with holes, and another simply vanished into the sea. The report from that mission caused discomfort in the Imperial Navy officers. It didn't make sense. In theory, in turns, the Zero should still win. But the combat hadn't happened in the arena they chose. The enemy simply refused to play the same game. And for the first time, an uncomfortable question arose: what if the Hellcat's weight wasn't a flaw, but precisely the weapon the Americans wanted to use? The news of the Marcus Island encounter spread quickly. Petty Officer Fukui's report, the first man to face a Hellcat and survive to tell, seemed more like a rant than a military document. The terms he used were almost inconceivable to Japanese doctrine. The enemy climbs with fury and doesn't yield altitude. 6 guns firing in chorus, armor that resists direct fire. It was as if he were describing a monster, not an airplane. And in a way, that's exactly what it was. In the following days, the Japanese command tried to rationalize the defeat. Some officers blamed luck, others lack of tactical support. But in silence, veteran pilots began to admit that something had changed. The Americans, who before danced in wide, predictable turns, now dove and climbed as if they possessed infinite energy. They no longer dueled. They executed. The definitive confirmation came less than a week later, over the waters near Wake Island. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga, another respected ace, was leading 12 Zeros on a routine patrol. Japanese radar primitive and intermittent detected movement to the south. A small group of American fighters. Shiga smiled. It seemed the perfect opportunity for a classic attack: dive from above, take advantage of surprise, and finish the enemy before he knew what hit him. From the height of 20,000 feet, the Zeros began the dive. The sound of engines tore the air, and the sun was at their backs, blinding the opponents. It was the ideal setup, the textbook bounce, as the manual said. But what happened in the following seconds violated all possible manuals. The Hellcats below didn't scatter in panic. They didn't make the expected evasive maneuvers. They simply tilted their noses down and began accelerating. They maintained formation, descending with frightening precision, as if they had rehearsed every move. The Japanese instinct said that with suicide diving with the enemy was the sure way to lose energy and become easy prey. But when the first trace of bullets crossed the air, something became clear. It wasn't them dictating the fight's rhythm. The Hellcat, heavy and aerodynamic, dove faster. Gravity worked in its favor. Japanese bullets ricocheted off the reinforced fuselage, while American .50 projectiles tore through the air like hammers thrown by an invisible god. A Zero hit squarely disintegrated in the air like wet paper. Another tried to climb back up, but was followed by two Hellcats, which, instead of trying to turn, climbed straight, used the momentum, and reversed trajectory in a sharp blow, firing again. Shager watched the scene and felt his heart sink. That wasn't a fight, it was a controlled slaughter. An aerial massacre with laboratory precision. Of the 12 Zeros that took off with him, only 4 returned. No Hellcat was lost. For the first time since the war began, the myth of the Zero began to crack. Japanese pilots realized they were fighting an enemy that didn't behave like a human adversary. The Americans had discovered a new kind of war of energy. While the Zero bet everything on horizontal turns, the Hellcat dominated the vertical axis. It climbed brutally, dove with weight, controlled altitude like someone controlling a chessboard. Every meter gained in the sky was converted into potential energy, every dive into kinetic energy. The combination of the two formed a cycle of destruction. The Hellcat didn't need to be more agile. It just needed to be more patient, colder, more methodical. And there was another factor the Japanese simply couldn't match: communication. While their radios were disposable pieces, seen as dead weight, the Americans treated them as an extension of the squadron's collective brain. 2 voices, 3, 4, united in a single tactical flow. The result was something new, almost frightening. 2 Hellcats flew together like a single organism. One lured the enemy, the other downed him. It was the birth of a legendary tactic, the thack weave. The Japanese, accustomed to fighting like duelists, didn't know how to handle that. In every confrontation, the sense of impotence grew. Lieutenant Tadashi Tanamizu, veteran of dozens of missions, gathered his squadron in Rabaul and gave a speech recorded in a diary recovered after the war. Forget everything you learned about dogfight. The Americans no longer fight. They hunt. Tanamizu described with surgical precision the transformation everyone saw, but few admitted. The Hellcat wasn't just an aircraft, it was the reflection of a civilization that had turned war into industry. The factory replaced the dojo. The 2000 horsepower engine replaced the samurai spirit. Radio coordination replaced intuition. Every piece of the American system pilot, radar, carrier, logistics fit into a gear that turned without stopping. While the Japanese still spoke of honor and duel, the Americans had become workers of destruction. And in the new battlefield that emerged, there was no room for romanticism. The result was an increasingly cruel statistic. For every Hellcat down, dozens of Zeros vanished. The skies of the Pacific, once the elegant domain of Nipponese aces, began to change color. The light silver of the Zero gave way to the dark blue of the Hellcats. And with every American victory, a truth became harder to deny: the war of the samurai had ended. The era of machines had begun. June 1944. The sun rises over the Philippine Sea, and the air is heavy with foreboding. The Japanese fleet, once the pride of the empire, sails with the hope of a last gamble, a desperate attempt to regain lost dominance. 9 carriers, hundreds of aircraft scraped from decimated squadrons, pilots too rushed to be called veterans. The operation's name sounds ambitious, a go. But in the shadows, the Americans call what's coming something else: a turkey shoot, a turkey hunt. On the Japanese carriers, the mood is one of false confidence. Officers still talk of final decision, of Bushido spirit. They believe the Zero's superior range and the pilot's fervor can balance the game. But the statistics, cold as the metal of the deck, tell another story. The Hellcats already rack up hundreds of victories, and their crews arrive at combat with a support system Japan can't even imagine. At the center of that system is something invisible and merciless: radar. While the Japanese still rely on lookouts and chance, American controllers watch the ocean through glowing green screens, tracking every dot, every formation, every signal. For them, the sky is a board, and the Hellcats are pieces moved with surgical precision. When the radar detects the first enemy wave, 150 miles away, the fighter directors are already plotting interception routes. The Japanese, on the other hand, fly blind. Admiral Ozawa, commander of the Carrier Air Force, believes he caught the Americans off guard. He doesn't know his entire fleet is already marked, his pilots tracked, and his formation studied. What he sends as a glorious offensive, the Americans receive as a schedule. The first Japanese wave departs, 69 aircraft. The heat of the deck is cut by gasping engines and cries of "Banzai" in the sky. The formation tries to align, but many of the young pilots have never practiced group flight at high altitudes. Fuel is scarce, communication almost non-existent. They believe they're going hunting. They're going to the slaughter. Minutes later, the trap closes. Ahead of them, at altitudes of 20 to 30,000 feet, a dark blue curtain waits. 60 Hellcats, flying in staggered layers as if forming a living wall of steel. The sun reflects off the wings and polished hulls. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, a Japanese veteran, is the first to see and understand. It looked like a wall of sky and fire, he would write later. The attack lasts less than 15 minutes. The Hellcats dive in pairs, each duo coordinating the descent at a perfect angle. The dive's force turns the Hellcats' weight into an advantage. They fire, climb, fire again. The Zeros try to react, pulling tight turns, but the opponent never stays in the same plane long enough. With every turn attempt, the Japanese loses energy. The American gains altitude. The result is a choreographed massacre. Of the 69 Japanese planes in that first wave, 42 are shot down before even reaching the target. Others fall on the way back, out of fuel or in flames. The American controllers in the carrier cabins barely need to adjust the plan. It's a systematic, impersonal, almost mathematical slaughter. When the second and third Japanese waves depart, the scenario repeats. The radar detects, the command adjusts, the Hellcats intercept. The pattern is always the same: altitude, dive, concentrated fire, withdrawal. It's the perfect application of the American aerial combat philosophy: efficiency over elegance, result over glory. The Japanese pilots still try to duel, trusting in reflexes and courage. But their enemies don't duel. They execute a protocol. Each Hellcat is a piece of a much larger machine, one that involves engineers, operators, mechanics, radio technicians, and radar commanders. There's no room for individuality, only for performance. By nightfall, the sea is covered in debris. Over 300 Japanese aircraft have been destroyed in a single day. The Imperial Navy, which for 2 years dominated the Pacific skies, is now an air force only in name. On the American decks, the pilots, exhausted and covered in grease and sweat, let slip a joke that spreads like wildfire. It was like hunting turkeys in the backyard. The phrase becomes a nickname: the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In Japan, the reports arrive in silence. No heroic speech can mask the collapse. Admiral Ozawa writes in his diary a phrase that sums up the tragedy: "We fought against a machine, not against men," and that's exactly it. The Hellcat wasn't the villain of a story about individual bravery. It was the symbol of a new paradigm: war as industry. Every screw in that fighter represented not just technology, but the sum of American economic power, standardization, and scale. Japan still tried to win with warriors. The United States won with systems. The June 1944 massacre wasn't the immediate end of the Japanese Empire, but it was the moment the sky itself changed owners. From then on, every Japanese takeoff carried a shadow, the certainty that, at some invisible point on the radar, Hellcats were waiting, cold and patient, ready to turn another flight into a statistic. The Turkey Shoot of June 1944 wasn't just a military defeat. It was the epitaph of an entire philosophy. In the silence that followed the massacre, the Japanese command realized something had broken forever: not just their dominance, but the myth of the invincible pilot. The aces who once flew with the awe of gods now landed exhausted, humiliated, and looked at the skies with fear. The enemy was no longer a man, but an impersonal gear that saw everything, calculated everything, and made no mistakes. Without experienced pilots, Japan tried to plug holes with boys. The training program, which at the war's start required years of refinement and hundreds of flight hours, now boiled down to rushed weeks. Fuel was so scarce that new recruits often learned to fly in gliders, without engines, simulating imaginary combats. The first time many touched a real fighter was also their last. Meanwhile, the Americans perfected the machine. On board, radar-guided interceptions with surgical precision. Each Hellcat received direct radio orders from the carrier deck. The pilots, trained en masse, acted as extensions of a single mind. The Pacific War had ceased to be a duel and become a process. The sky was no longer sacred territory of warriors, but a production line of victories. The contrast was painful. On one side, young Japanese still bowing before takeoff, repeating oaths of honor, carrying family photos and poems. On the other, practical American pilots, trained for efficiency and return. A successful flight was one that completed the mission and came back for the next. The concept of sacrifice had been replaced by that of yield. It was in that difference that Japan found its last form of resistance desperation elevated to doctrine. When Admiral Takejiro Onishi proposed the creation of kamikaze units, he no longer spoke of tactics, but of math. If a Zero attacks a carrier conventionally, the chance of success is almost zero. But if the pilot becomes the bomb, the chance rises to 30%. It was the cold logic of the end: turn the body into a missile, life into fuel. The Hellcats were called to face this new threat, and almost symbolically, they became the final shield. In Okinawa in 1945, as waves of kamikazes dove on the American fleet, the Hellcats flew endless patrols, downed hundreds before they reached the targets, and ironically, saved the lives of sailors who would never see the face of who protected them. The heavy fighter, which the Japanese had ridiculed, now became the wall between the fleet and apocalypse. When the war finally ended, the scale of the American victory revealed itself in almost inhuman numbers. Over 12,000 Hellcats produced in 30 months. A new aircraft every hour rolling off the assembly line in Bethpage, New York. On the other side, an exhausted Japan with destroyed factories, dead pilots, and fuel counted in drops. After the surrender, engineer Jiro Horikoshi, the creator of the Zero, had the chance to examine a captured Hellcat. His words, recorded decades later, sound like an epitaph. We designed an aircraft for 1941. They designed a system for 1945. He understood, perhaps before everyone, that Japan had fought the wrong war with the right weapons and lost it not in the sky, but on the assembly line. And then there remained the testimony of those who lived to see the complete transformation. Saburo Sakai, the same man who, 2 years earlier, had laughed at the report speaking of a fat American fighter. Old, blind in one eye, he gave an interview in 2000 shortly before dying. When asked about the Hellcat, he fell silent for a few seconds, a silence that seemed to contain the weight of an entire generation. We thought we were samurai, he said at last. But the Hellcat showed us we weren't warriors, we were just men with outdated weapons facing the future. Sakai acknowledged what few admitted: the Hellcat didn't just win in the sky. It destroyed an era. It represented the passage from a world where talent and honor decided the battle to another where victory was the product of gears, calculations, and soulless factories. The Japanese pilots laughed at the Hellcat. They laughed at its weight, its ugliness, its apparent lack of elegance. They didn't realize that every extra kilo in that fuselage was a symbol of a more powerful engine, of armor that protected the pilot, of a self-sealing tank that gave him more chances to return alive. It was the weight of industrial logic overcoming the romanticism of art. In the end, the laughter ceased. It turned into silence, then fear, and finally resignation. The Pacific sky, which had once been a stage for duels between masters, had become a production line of deaths. And the Hellcat, the 19-to-1 slaughter machine, had the last word not spoken aloud, but etched in steel and smoke. The era of the samurai had ended. The era of the machines had begun.